This is the recap video for blood. Your next test is going to be over the cardiovascular system. The cardiovascular system is going to contain three components that we've talked about: blood, the heart, and then blood vessels. So remember, blood is a fluid connective tissue, and its functions are to transport dissolved gases. It transports oxygen out to your cells, and then it brings carbon dioxide back to your heart so it can be released through your lungs. It also helps transport nutrients, hormones, and wastes. It helps regulate your pH, restricts fluid loss or blood clotting. It defends against pathogens, and it helps stabilize your body temperature. So be familiar with these characteristics of blood, what blood's temperature is, that it's 5 times more viscous than water, that its pH falls between about 7.35 and 7.45. Typically, males have more blood than females, and it's about 7% of your body weight in kilograms. We talked about different blood tests that can be done, but then we focused on the components of blood. The first component of blood is plasma, and plasma makes up 46 to 63 component or parts of your whole blood. When we're talking about whole blood, we're talking about plasma and formed elements. So plasma is that first part of whole blood, and plasma is made up of three components: plasma protein, solute, and then most of plasma is water. The other component of whole blood is formed elements, and formed elements are going to make up between 37 to 54% of that whole blood. You have platelets, and platelets play a role in blood clotting. We have our red blood cells, which help transport all dissolved gases. And then we have our white blood cells, which play a role in defense. And then we'll get into each one of those specifically. So, blood's formed elements, or our platelets, our red blood cells, and our white blood cells, are made through a process called hemopoiesis or hematopoiesis. This happens in the red bone marrow of our skeletal system. And there's a series of events that causes that to happen, and then we talked about the different terms for the formation of different cells. So remember, when we're talking about white blood cells, they can be called leukocytes. When we're talking about red, they can be called erythrocytes. And when we eventually get to platelets, those can be called thrombocytes. So let's talk about erythrocytes, or our red blood cells. They have that bioconcave disc shape, which allows them to hold more dissolved gases. They're able to fit through our narrow vessels because they're flexible. They're called ghost cells because they're cells without organelles, and they live about 120 days within our circulatory system. A big part of our red blood cells is hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a protein that allows us to carry oxygen and carbon dioxide. Another thing that you need to know about your red blood cells is when red blood cells are made in our bone marrow, the hormone erythropoietin stimulates that formation of red blood cells. We took a look at what happens when our red blood cells die and where our iron goes. Remember, hemoglobin, part of it is iron. And so what happens with that iron is it either gets urinated out or we release it in our feces. Then we took a long look at blood typing. So with blood typing, our red blood cells have surface proteins, or antigens. And antigens tell us what blood type you have. So if you have type A blood, on your cell surface, you're going to have type A antigens. Also, along with your blood types, you have antibodies. And antibodies are going to be found in your plasma, and they're going to be against the other blood types. So for example, if I have type A blood, I have type A antigens, but anti-B antibodies. I would be familiar with each blood type and what antigens are present, what antibodies are present, and what other blood types they can donate to and receive blood from. We also talked about the Rh factor. The Rh factor is just another protein on the surface of your red blood cells. If you have it, you're Rh positive. If you don't, you're Rh negative. We talked about the importance of knowing our blood type when it comes to blood transfusions, because when our blood is not compatible and your antibodies and your antigens match up, it's going to cause blood to clump or to agglutinate. This can be really serious because that blood clot can travel to your brain or to your lungs, but it's also a big factor with pregnant women. When a woman is Rh negative and she's carrying an Rh positive, This can be very dangerous because her body will start to make the antibodies against the baby's Rh positive blood, and it can eventually end up attacking the baby's blood and harming both the mom and the baby. And that disease is called hemolytic disease of the newborn. Then we took a look at different red blood cell pathologies. And we moved on to leukocytes or white blood cells. Our white blood cells, their main function is defense. They're here to protect us from any foreign invaders. And then we got into the different types of white blood cells. You had neutrophils. The most important thing to know about neutrophils is they're the most numerous type of white blood cells. You had eosinophils, and what I'd like you to know about them is that they increase during allergic reactions. Basophils, the pullout point of this is they're going to release histamine at an injury site. We talked about monocytes, and monocytes, their main function is they're going to release chemicals that are going to attract all the other types of white blood cells to the site to help fight off that infection. And then we took a look at lymphocytes, and lymphocytes are specific cells in our body that fight specific diseases. And we'll talk about those more when we get to the immune system in our next unit. We then took a look at white blood cell pathologies, which led us into platelets or thrombocytes. So platelets are involved in the blood clotting process. They help us form a platelet plug or a scab, and they live only about 9 to 12 days. So hemostasis is the process that causes bleeding to stop. Hemostasis is the blood clotting process, and it happens in 3 phases: the vascular phase, the platelet phase, and the coagulation phase. In order for the coagulation phase to happen, there's a couple different pathways. The intrinsic and the extrinsic pathway work together to activate the common pathway. And the main goal of all of this is we form a blood clot, so we stop bleeding. Like I said, for the common pathway to work, both the intrinsic and extrinsic pathways have to be activated, and the end goal is to form that blood clot. So once we have that blood clot, we got to get rid of it eventually when our tissue starts to heal. So you have your clot retraction phase, which is going to bring together the sites of your injury and seal up that area. And then you have the fibrinolysis phase, which is when your blood clot dissolves. Then we looked at anticoagulants, which are blood thinners, which help stop your blood from clotting. And then talked about platelet pathologies. And that's all you need to know about blood. Really focus in on what blood is made out of, the components of whole blood, and then each type and function of those formed elements: your red blood cells, your white blood cells, and your platelets.